Chapter Detective Spliff. Francis was awoken in the early morning hours by tapping on his door. The apartment was built for a human, but it was still quite small, the bed not being far from the door. He didn't know what time of day it was because the apartments had only tiny decorative windows. The quiet tapping, however, clearly indicated discretion. He opened the door a crack, and there was Spliff's face above a lit oil lamp. Francis let him in. Together they sat on the bed. It was clear Spliff had been up for a while, perhaps having never gone to sleep. "So," Spliff said, trying to build up steam, "here's what I need to do. I need to see what's happening in that workshop, box, whatever you call it. I need to see how this ionic light from the sky works." "Okay," Francis agreed. "Why not?" "Will you come with me?" "Sure." "Good." Spliff hopped off the bed. He meant now. Francis raised his eyebrows and rubbed his face. What was he doing here again? Walking through the dark early morning streets, the lamps illuminated with a dull light which seemed to pulse rather than flicker, Francis said, "This is like the opposite of doing something for the fun of it. We're doing it for the not fun of it." Spliff couldn't dignify this playful crankiness with a response. He'd slept poorly. He was barely paying attention. To give undue dignity took more concentrated effort than he was capable of producing, yet even in this tired state he felt manic. He felt claustrophobic, like if he didn't do something the whole mountain might collapse in on him. Spliff was glancing around furtively. He jumped when they spooked a shabbily dressed gnome who was taking a drink from a bottle put in the trash cart from the night's previous celebration. The companions continued on. Francis felt he was finally understanding the basic structure of the mountain homes they walked past. Each had a set of stairs heading upwards, which was the living level which could receive sun. Below were the sleeping quarters, soundproofed for more private activities. He was also aware, now that he was paying attention, that they were walking in a circle. In his head he could now construct a quasi-map. Around the outer perimeters of the dome were the well-to-do households. As one went inward into the circle, the houses became more like stacked apartments. But they had walked in through the market, which must have meant the market was skewed more towards one edge of the circle. Spliff's eyes were following a gray rope which connected the lamps, looking for a place where they converged. At a corner he saw two gray ropes turn, and he turned to follow. As they walked inwardly towards the center of the city, Spliff said to Francis, "That wasn't thunder, the sound we heard last night." "How do you know?" Francis asked honestly. "That crack, it sounded familiar. Also, the reverberation. That must have come from inside." Francis agreed. It seemed unlikely such a sound came from outside the mountain. "Why would he lie?" Francis asked. In the mornings he was hopelessly naive to machinations, manipulations. Well, not just the mornings. Truth was, his mind was half elsewhere, thinking about when they'd have breakfast. He needed a cup of tea. He thought about something he'd considered many times before, being a wanderer and his relationship with time. Some people live their life by calendar, milestones of the year. He was a scheduler, but it was an internal schedule. Francis could be, practically, anywhere. What had made him a proficient or sane wandering druid was this ability to schedule without hopes for gains. But his own internal schedule was more rigorous than those who lived by the calendar. In the afternoon or evening he could roll with all happenings, but in the early hours, with the sharpness of his mind and some tea leaf blending warmly with breakfast, he needed time to himself, to sit in silence or watch the leaves blow in the breeze, to read a book or just think. Which is all another way to say he wasn't paying attention to Spliff's mood. He hadn't even tangentially considered the danger Spliff could be in, a danger that Spliff could do nothing other than worry about. For example, how had Keppo made his way into this inner circle? How had he become a gnome of seemingly even higher importance than the council themselves? He'd seen a counselor in the garden afraid to go to talk to Falcior. Keppo bounded up to the great wizard like it was nothing. How could he have possibly made himself so indispensable? He'd never been particularly bright. That's what Spliff liked about him as a friend. Keppo would babble, and Spliff got to basically zone out, insert little comments when he felt interested. As childhood friends, Keppo had a presence of body so familiar it relaxed Spliff's nerves. The possibility of such relaxation was gone. There were conversations he needed to have now. It would be impossible to go on living without answers. For one, Keppo's rise in esteem and station seemed intimately related to the marriage timeline with Haida. Of course, that was where he should start, something innocuous. "And how did you two end up together then?" But he felt, deep in his bowels, even such a benign question could be dangerous. The other thing Spliff knew about Keppo was that he was impulsive and reckless, a bad combination for someone in power. Not only was Spliff thinking about himself, and that if his knowledge about a theramite was a secret Keppo and the wizard were keeping from the city proper, he was a liability to that secret. If he hurt Keppo's ego, Keppo might reflectively hurt Haida or her children. How deeply into it was his sister? Undoubtedly, she had first access to his journals. He'd never suspected she would care, but perhaps she was the true mastermind. Who, in this life, could he truly trust? These were all questions that needed answers, but first he needed leverage. None of the roads heading towards the center of the dome connected in a straight line. They zigged and zagged, Spliff's eyes always following the gray rope. Exiting out of a narrow alley, Francis saw the center of the dome for the first time. Spliff gave him immediate context, though he seemed to struggle with the first words, as they didn't translate properly in his head. The area of remembrance, or at least it used to be. Standing on tall wooden scaffolding, a big gray box stood over the would-be park. At its corners, gray ropes converged. Around the outer edges was a small platform which could be patrolled. From the top of the box, a thin piece of metal extended up through the air in the dome to the ceiling where it disappeared into the rock. They walked ahead, following stone paths, each marked with a name. Large boulders beside the paths, inscribed with family insignia and quotations, most of them in Yomish script. Francis saw one written in common script which read, "Out from the mines into the sky." Spliff kept his eyes on the gray box. Getting closer now, there was an audible humming, which reminded Francis of the sound of a hummingbird's wings when they were by one's ear. Spliff moved forward quietly. He was used to being quiet in this place. He had to admit the gray box in the morning twilight did give the whole place a more mournful air, like the gray box was being powered by souls being pulled upwards to it from the stones. Francis followed suit, walking softly on the balls of his feet. They saw a human guard sitting in a chair by the door to the gray box, his chin on his chest. Spliff's mind started to race. One sleeping guard. Surely some infiltration was doable, but how to get up there without making any noise? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of scraping cartwheels on the main path of fine gravel. Two guards were accompanying another human pushing a covered cart towards them. As they got nearer, one of the guards shouted at the odd couple. Spliff and Francis did nothing, stood still until one of the guards came up and approached them aggressively. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his jaw visibly tight under his short beard. This was a good question, Francis thought. He didn't have an answer, so he remained silent. Thinking on his feet, Spliff said they were there to pay respects. "Closed until high sun. You should know better," the guard said with an arrogant tone of anyone whose whole existence finds meaning in the glorification of authority. Spliff's hackles were raised, opposed to authority by nature, but also being a gnome in a gnome space where it was generally understood as taboo for humans to enter. But having a human companion, as he did, he couldn't exactly litigate on those terms. He explained he had just returned to the city and was not aware of the new regulations. "We'll leave, no problem," Spliff said, gesturing towards Francis that they walk away. At the end of the main path, Spliff took a quick glance backwards to see the humans continuing on with their task, pushing the cart to the stairs and unloading crates. "Why did they need a cart?" Francis asked quietly. More than anything, trying to be friendly and pay tribute to the idea he was here with Spliff, caring about the questions. Spliff didn't try to answer this question. In turn, he also said the friendly thing. "Come on, let's get breakfast." Francis was shivering by the time they ducked into Jemima's cozy little tavern in the descent of the mountain, and he was more than ready for a hot beverage. He understood the abandoned streets. The cold could really get under one's skin. He wondered about the mines, how they kept warm. Spliff informed him the dome didn't really wake up until the sun had been out for a couple hours, but Jemima was an anomaly, proclaimed she slept 4 hours a night. She brought them mountain tea with a small glass of hot cider as a bonus. The tea was peppery, and Jemima was impressed when Francis identified one of the main herbs as mountain thistle. He'd moved to the gnome-sized stool and was sitting cross-legged on the ground. Francis had to reach up slightly to grab his drinks. Spliff asked if she would converse in common with them so Francis could hear the conversation. Jemima shrugged, turned back to flip the sausages and thick bread she was toasting on the grill. "So there's never been any pushback, them taking over the cemetery?" Spliff asked. "Oh, at first there was plenty," Jemima said. "But the day the light came, well, everything changed. Many Yomes really do think of him as the second coming of Falcior, and who's to say he isn't? Not me." "Then why does he have the humans working for him, not gnomes?" Spliff's pronunciation of gnomes was still presented with a formal flourish, unlike Jemima's. "Well, he says he's using the humans, Us Yomes meant to be free. He didn't tell a Yome what to do." "So why not give us the magic like Falcior did with the metal? See what we can do with it on our own." "It ain't the same. Anyway, we already got the light. What else is there?" "But why? Why now?" Spliff asked. Jemima shoved them plates of hot bread and sausage. "Why? You were always the kind to keep asking why. Like you never really grew up and realized there ain't no why. Just is, far as I can tell." Though after the joking tone of this sentence, she did lean up to the counter. "There is some Yomes who aren't happy about it, though. Miners get ornery. Humans traipsing through, but if a human touches a gnome, they don't get to come back. Oh, aye." She remembered something and reached under her counter, pulling out a couple pieces of folded paper. "There's a group that meets in here sometimes. 4 of them. Some gnomes up in the dome lost their plots. The council kicked them out, and they weren't too happy. They wrote about that. There's this lady elf. She's trying to get the gnomes to understand the bad things the humans in the city do to her kind. She says she got..." Jemima leaned in even closer. "Raped by a group of them." She said the word rape as if it were a fate worse than death. Francis wondered if that was a personal issue or true for gnomes in general. Their history as slaves had probably included sexual abuse. He didn't let his mind wander any farther in that direction. He was still eating his sausage. Spliff picked up the pamphlet and read quietly for a bit. He looked over at Francis and offered the paper to see if he'd like to read. Francis obliged. He opened it up to the headline, "Arms being hoarded in camp outside mountain." That clearly sounded serious. "Most of the other Yomes think she's just hateful because of the. Jemima continued, pouring herself a new cup of tea from the hot kettle. "If there's anything worse than a human who thinks they know everything, it's an elf who thinks they know everything," Spliff responded, as if quoting. Francis could tell that Spliff wasn't being serious. He was being generic for the sake of friendliness. "True and truer," Jemima nodded. "Most of the Yomes can't take much of it serious. Oh, you lost your plot in the dome? Well, I guess you'll have to live like the rest of us then." Francis's legs had already been stiff from the cold, sitting on the floor. He felt his butt going numb. He put his plate back on the bar with a thank you for breakfast and found a bench to lie on while continuing to read the pamphlet. Jemima went back to talking in Yomish with Spliff. Francis wasn't at all sure what the story in the pamphlet was implying. It was meant to worry the gnomes, but from his brief interactions they seemed unflappable creatures. "They have weapons, so do we." And the high ground. Maybe the writers of this pamphlet were testing the arrogance of their gnome compatriots. They just didn't know which chord to strike. Getting one's arrogance checked was a highly personal moment. Francis doubted it could be accomplished in print. The only battles which could be waged on paper were esoteric and philosophical battles. Preemptive understanding. It was unclear, from the words on the pamphlet, exactly what the information was supposed to make one do. But Francis respected this. It was the writers admitting there were things in this situation about which they were still unsure. That came from a place of honesty. After all, reading was only ever for the curious, and these words did make him curious. Why would a group be stockpiling arms outside a place which manufactured arms? That was like a turd stockpiling flies or a bird waiting for a day with no wind. His analogies felt lethargic this morning. Francis sat up on the bench and walked back over to the bar, the hair on his head almost grazing the ceiling. He could feel an exchange between the ceiling and his hair, which in full concentration almost felt like the outside wind on his arm hair. Perhaps the wind was just 1,000 thousands exchanges between living things. Druids had long speculated that the wind came from trees, and that would explain it, all those leaves next to each other exchanging energies. But that didn't explain days without wind. If the wind was just interaction, the wind would be relatively constant. Perhaps it... Francis was roused from his thoughts by noticing the two gnomes looking at him, standing there. "I think we should find her," Francis said, with the pretend finality of someone who had been thinking really hard about a decision even though the words had been entirely instinct. Spliff was grateful for the enthusiasm. He needed extra energy from somewhere or someone to get the answers for his questions, and in that moment he felt he grew very noticeably closer to Francis. Chapter: One night at the Black Bear Inn. Miniwoona had come to the mountain 2 years earlier. She and her band of traveling musicians had been commissioned to play for a regalia up in the dome. She didn't know the particulars of why, only that, upon arrival, they were too early and had to stay outside the mountain until the night of the party. They wouldn't receive any coin until after the performance, so the band set up camp on the outskirts of town. At the time, there was tension between Min and her bandmates. Almost none of it her fault. Well, it was her fault that she hadn't found anything better to do than keep playing fiddle in a band with her ex, who had always promised her he was going to make her renowned, on his shoulders, of course, but instead had found a different singer, who he argued harmonized with him better, which, to be fair, was true to a degree, and when she'd realized that their relationship was not helpful for her personally, or the band, they decided to break off the relationship, but it was friendly enough until he started dating the singer, wherein she started to feel awkward being around them all the time. That evening in particular, she couldn't stomach looking at their faces in close proximity and the little looks of intimacy. All she wanted was fried duck and some good pickles. They'd been on the road. She needed something to cheer herself up. Scuttlebutt and little Iona was the Black Bear always served duck. She'd seen plenty of rough situations and felt overconfident she could hold her own in most situations. She'd learned how to wield a whip, partly as an exercise to keep her wrist loose after hours of playing the fiddle. In her head, she had a command of the space between her and others. She thought often of this space. Space is what she liked about music, its ability to float between and create the illusion that space had dissipated while still being comfortably removed from the physical bodies of an audience. Min found the whip quite like music. The crack whip made as good a deterrent as actual pain. She sat at a far table of the inn, minding her own business. The crowd was enough mixed. She wasn't thinking much of anything, just wondering to herself if the sound of a stomach grumbling could be understood as a musical notation, or if all music had been made to distract from one's stomach, replacing emptiness with the flutter of heartbeats. One felt lost in the song's persuasion of true love. Min was halfway through her meal when the incident occurred. She could no longer remember if she liked the duck. 2 of the main tables had been pushed together, seating a group of 10-looking toughs. So far, they'd been sufficiently occupied with their food and drink. The door to the inn opened with a thwack as 2 men wrestled a third man into the inn, holding him tightly by the arms. Very discreetly, many of the couples got up and left the dining room. One of the men said loudly to the table, "This idiot hit one of the gnomes." The man being held by the other 2 squalled in his defense. "It told me I wasn't fit to be raised by pigs. I said we'll see who's the pigs, but I didn't kill him or nothing." Not a word was said for one long-held breath, the men at the table looking across their shoulders at one figure. The only features Min saw from her seat was his broad back and choppy, thin hair. He wore a short coat which bunched up, revealing a patch of skin on his lower back. From Min's perspective, he looked like an overfed adolescent, unaware of the entirety of his appearance. Still, he stood up gracefully, slowly, that is, adjusted his coat. He drew a knife out of the thick leather scabbard on his hip, and without pause ran it across the held man's throat. The yelp and gurgle of the man partially muffled her own yelp, or maybe she'd just imagined making a noise, just like she'd imagined the hot blood running down her own neck. The men holding his arms let him drop with a thud to the inn floor. As soon as they did so, the leader told the men to pick him back up, get him out in the dirt, and they did so, exiting with less enthusiasm than they'd entered, grunting with the burden. The broad-backed man took his seat back at the table. Min looked at her pickled radishes, tried to put one in her mouth and chew, but the vinegar made her taste blood. Had she bit her tongue? One of the figures who was facing her at the table said something quietly to the broad-backed man, glancing in her direction. The broad-backed man turned, revealing a face with an odd series of pock-marked scars like constellations. He stared her down without thought, like a horse in a field noticing a squirrel. It made her feel so small. In retrospect, what happened next felt inevitable, like she'd never had any agency. She'd just never known it before. She rose and walked out the door, stepping gently around the blood on the floor. At first she thought she was safe. She started walking away quickly, then two men came out of the inn and started following her. She was unfamiliar with the streets, so chose a side street randomly. The building scared her, like the whole city was a hive that might suddenly be wakened and start pursuing her. They called after her. She began to run. She turned and turned again. Then she tripped. It was right by a pen for caged animals. She was trapped. She'd have to jump the gate, then jump again, and then what? She rose and unwound the whip from her waist. When her pursuers turned and found her, one of them cackled. She cracked her whip in the air. They didn't move forward. She didn't move. And then all of a sudden she screamed and didn't know why or when she screamed. She dropped her arm and the men rushed her. They had her on the ground like an animal. She struggled, but finally one of them had both her wrists. He sat on her chest as the other man pulled down her trousers. The trousers she wore to blend in with men. She had nothing then. All the pretense was gone. The one sitting on top of her chest was looking at her very sincerely. The other, whom she couldn't see, seemed to be biting her legs. The one down by her feet asked the one sitting on her chest to move so he could stick his prick in her, and then the one on top said to hold on, hold her down, and he tied the skinny part of her whip around her wrists and dragged her near the fence and wrapped the handle loosely around one of the posts, and then he stood up and told the other man to leave. Of course he protested, but the man seemed invested. He took out a small sack of coin and gave it to the other man, telling him he could go buy a whore. He'd take care of everything. And it worked. The other man trotted off, stupid and happy. The thug who was left took down his trousers and said, "I thought you'd like it better just you and me." And when he was on top of her and kissed her face and told her she was lovely, when he was finished, he said he'd always hoped to marry a girl like her. But I don't think we can be seen together. And he untied the whip and told her the unnecessary details about how she should never go back to that inn ever, leave the city. And Min nodded, a reluctant tear rolling through the dirt on her face. Back at camp, she didn't get into the tent they all shared. She put more wood on the fire and threw a blanket around her shoulders and stared at the flames. She stripped naked and burned the clothes she was wearing, and when they woke her in the morning, in the fetal position, naked, wrapped in a blanket, the band's concern was lost on her. Like they were concerned for someone else. That blanket had been her cocoon. Who she was today wasn't the same Min of yesterday. It felt horrible, knowing now the previous person had never really been her at all. Chapter: The Pamphleteers. Francis was beginning to wonder why gnomes had the reputation of grumpiness, coldness, bitterness. It wasn't the first time which he realized racism existed, but so far gnomes seemed profoundly the opposite of their reputation. It didn't make sense how that idea even got into his head. Although a bit furtive at first, Tycho let them into his small home in the incline graciously. Spliff spoke to him in Yomish briefly before they switched over to Common so Francis could participate. Spliff explained who he was and what Jemima told them about the pamphleting project, little as they had been told, and they were looking for the elf who started it all. She was trying to get into the mountain, Tycho explained. She said she'd left her fiddle, but the guards weren't buying it, so I pretended to know her, and after we talked, I realized the guards were right. She was a liar. Tycho laughed, rocking in his easy chair in the small living room. Again, Francis was sat on the ground, and he cursed the flatness of his behind. But her story was so compelling, Tycho continued. Most gnomes ignore the problems of humans, but I don't think we're allowed that luxury anymore. We can't let so many into the mountain like this without considering what they're doing. Anyway, an elf has as much to hold against a human as a gnome. I'm finding it curious, the response to this light from the box, Spliff said. I would think gnomes would demand openness, but again we have retreated to complacency. I agree. Tycho nodded and reached into his side table for a box of matches, noticing Spliff had pulled out his pipe. He admired the matchbox like a relic from a bygone era before tossing them over to Spliff. I was working for the council, Tycho continued, trying to expand the school and accept more children into our higher-level alchemical programs, but after Falcior had been around for a few months, they told me it was unnecessary. I couldn't afford my home, and they bought it out from under me. Spliff took a lungful of smoke and hoped the tobacco magic would help his brain understand if it was the right place and time to discuss his discovery. He took another puff. His anxiety had waned from the high frequency he had been feeling last night. His eyelids felt heavy, and the tobacco was making his temples buzz. Telling someone else seemed like the only next thing to do, but such a thought made him defiant of its power. No, he was not compelled to do so just because he was tired. It was an odd internal wrestling match, which made for a strange atmosphere in the room. Even Tycho could tell. But he'd wait for his guests to continue. It was only logical. Why else would they have come unless they had something to share? Most gnomes didn't give a damn about the pamphlets. Had Tycho wanted to monetize the pamphlets at first? Sure, he would admit that was his first inclination. If their group increased the demand for information, it had been his life's calling to exchange such informations. But again and again he'd been reminded the demand was not significant. It took real happenings in a gnome's life to buck against convention, and with the return of Falcior, mountain life had never been more comfortable. The coin flew fast at the market. Even though he'd been screwed, the sale of his property in the dome was enough to buy a large estate out in the real world. Hell, he probably could have had some human peasants cook and clean for him. Francis was enjoying the silence. For the first time in the day, he felt like he could casually meditate. So much of life was about things happening. But either something did happen or it didn't. That was only two choices. How boring. Sitting in silence, there were more things happening than one could possibly perceive. Now that was true excitement. Living in the awareness of multitudes. But maybe he just liked silence. There was true magic in words, but almost because of that magic, he felt pressured to pay attention. Like someone might teach him a spell without knowing it, and if he didn't listen, it was now a skill he'd lost forever. The weird aura in the room was broken by Tycho's 10-year-old daughter, adorably carrying in a tray of sandwiches, her mother looking smilingly from around the corner. It was enough of a warm feeling. Spliff relaxed into the truth. Like a bowel movement he could no longer hold in. He waited for the child to leave before he spilled to Tycho. Tycho took out his box of cigars and offered them around. Francis took one obligingly. By Falcior, Tycho said, after his first couple puffs, ruminating on the information Spliff had just told him. The complete story of a Theramite. It explains everything. He had a faraway look, repeated himself. It explains everything. Everything. Then his face took on a look of grave concern. Sir, so you say you know this, that what they're mining for is not just copper and iron. Don't call him sir. Francis felt proud of his memory and smirked. They have to be. It would be too odd a coincidence. Spliff sucked on his now smokeless pipe. I guess they might have come to the discovery independently, but then why would it be my old friend? He was nobody special. They must have used my notebooks. How long have you been back? Tycho seemed legitimately concerned. A day and a half, Spliff said. This information is dangerous. I don't think we can pamphlet this. My family, I have to think about my family, Tycho said. I'm not asking you to put it in your pamphlet, Spliff said. Somehow it still hadn't clicked for Francis. The cigar was making him feel mildly woozy, so again his thoughts had turned internal. But some of the response by this other gnome was seeping into his conscience. He did seem gravely concerned. But what were they going to do to Spliff? Francis voiced as such without thinking. So what are they going to do? Kill you? Nobody spoke. Oh, Francis thought. I suppose they might. I think, Spliff was thinking out loud now, I think I need to know who his allies are. It had moved beyond the physical details. Now he was thinking about allegiances. Oh, by the oar, that was the last thing he'd wanted for his life. Maybe he should flee. Would they come after him? Spliff was spiraling. He knocked out his pipe on the floor and Tycho let it go, didn't protest about proper placement of the ash. We'll figure something out, Tycho said, inviting his guest to leave so he could process this information fully. I'll find you somewhere to stay. I mean, maybe you could stay with her? Nobody except me knows where she is. She won't be happy right away. You'll have to knock like this. Tycho knocked on the wood support of his rocker. 3, 1, 2, knocks. Francis rubbed his head. His hand started to tangle the mess of his hair, and now, horribly, he was thinking about politics, his appearance. Maybe he should get a haircut, have some armor for other people's perceptions of him. Why was he here again? Then another quote came to his mind. One does not need to pursue an opponent. They will make themselves known in time. Time, time, time for the next treat, the next disease. What was his time supposed to be? His life had been slow for so many years, and now then time inside him seemed to be speeding up. Maybe this was natural. Maybe his time was now. Maybe his failure to transmogrify was for him to be in this moment. Francis couldn't prove or disprove such a notion. Still, it felt bizarre, unreal. Without finding some reality inside himself, he might drift away, like a boat cut from its moorings. He'd much prefer to be under the ocean, instead of lost on top of it. Chapter Grayle Enlists. Grayle awoke in his small apartment in the dome, very well rested. Today was going to be a good day. By his notion, he'd made an inroad with one of the most powerful people on the planet. More or less exactly what he'd been looking for. It almost made losing Carl, his steward, bearable. Or maybe he'd needed to lose him so Carl could shine down his guidance from the ethereal plane. Maybe a shave to start the day. He'd felt out of place at the party, not having expected to be there. If he'd had more notice, he could have made a more refined impression. Try and warn me next time, Grayle said, speaking heavenward to his lost friend. At the end of the party, they'd gotten help moving his trunk up to his room. He found his short blade and powder made of dried milk and ground rose leaves. He needed a bit of water, and he didn't have much powder left. No, he had coin. He could get a shave at the market, whichever direction that was. Exiting his small apartment, he climbed upstairs, took a sharp 90-degree corner, and hitting the street, he was already lost. At home, it was very difficult to get lost. There was the estate and a jaunt of an hour into town. It was hard to get lost on one straight road. In the street, here, the curve didn't even let one know where it was going, and the tall facades of buildings meant one couldn't get a sense of direction. Finally, he decided to go where he knew and go back to the house of the party and ask for directions. The house was next door and easy to recognize. He opened the doors and walked in past the first staircase and towards the clattering sounds of eating. He walked in a few steps more to see guards armed with thin swords eating breakfast at a table near a doorway and the sounds of a kitchen. 4 of the guards saw Grayle approaching and stood up. Grayle held up his hands, showing he wasn't armed. "You're not supposed to be here," said the guard, most wary of imminent danger. Grayle acknowledged this. He started to explain, but the explanations didn't sound very good, so he decided to take the more direct approach. "Look, I want to work for you." One of the guards in the back laughed. The first guard, with a finely trimmed mustache, told him to leave before he got hurt. Grayle felt challenged. The only thing to do was challenge in return. He declared he'd fight any of them. The guard with the mustache told his friend behind him to give Grayle a sword, and he drew his own before Grayle had time to really get his bearings or feel confident in what was happening. Grayle let the sword clatter to the ground as it was tossed in front of him. He picked up the thin sword. He'd only ever trained with broadswords. He slashed the air in front of him. Using broadswords against armor had trained him that a sword was primarily effective as a bludgeoning instrument. If he timed a blow to the head with the full force of his torso muscles, he could knock the sense out of his opponent and sidestep whatever he did next. This type of sword would require considerably more finesse. Maybe he could talk his way out of it? Intimidation was his first instinct. Grayle puffed up his chest and dropped the sword, put up his fists. Where I come from, we fight like men, not princes trying to prick each other to death like some old seamstress with a needle. The guard with the mustache did not drop his sword. He was smaller than Grayle and thinner too. He had many options to consider, but before he'd finally decided, Falcior walked in from the garden still wearing his puffy cloud coat from the night before. He assessed the situation with a smile. I like the energy, but if you kill one of these men, you'll be working against me, not for me. Far more likely they will kill you, and then a couple of them will have to spend the rest of the day getting rid of your body, and then I'd have to pay them more, and they'd use the extra coin on another evening at the whorehouse and probably fall in love. One would end up running off to start some romantic farm life. Falcior sighed dramatically. But he'd be bad at it, because he's a soldier and all his friends are soldiers, and the whore would lose her lusty seal, and you see, it's no good for anybody. Falcior laughed at his own private joke. The laugh of someone who has the privilege to monologue and expect others to at least to pretend to find him amusing. Did you enjoy the party last night? Falcior walked up to the guard with the mustache and put a hand on his shoulder while speaking to Grayle. Grayle dropped his fists and did a slight bow. The guards sheathed their swords. Yes, it was like any other scene. It's become a regular feature up here. Falcior held up his hands. Gratitude makes for good parties. Come to the garden with me. He motioned for the guards to return to their breakfast. I'm a very good listener, and I believe I heard you'd like to join our small corps here in Ionatta, Falcior said as they entered the rock garden. I have one question I like to ask recruits, Falcior continued in a quieter tone. Clearly you are no simple recruit. I bet my life you were a knight. He returned to speaking normally. Still, I think it is a good question, and here it is. Are your parents friendly with each other? Falcior waited patiently while Grayle processed the question for many moments. Friendly. Define friendly. Simply, do they still live in the same household? They do. On that point, Grayle was confident. Don't really know where else my mother would go. You'd be surprised. What about your childhood? Was that friendly? Falcior asked. Yes, I was not unhappy. We had horses in the countryside. You see, I ask this question because I find that I need a certain level of nuance only passed down through noble blood. Noble blood can come from anywhere and isn't always possessed by landed families, though it is certainly more frequent in landed families than the peasantry. Grayle had not awoken this morning expecting an onslaught of questions and ideas. He felt like a kid sitting by his tutor, the tutor expecting an answer and him not even quite sure what was being asked. You see, I have surmised that if parents are not friendly to each other, it is unlikely they are friendly to their children. This makes the child full of fear, and I think the world should be less full of fear. You might say, well, this is precisely why you should rise up, peasants, instead of rewarding those who already have. But I cannot do as such for every peasant that's taken a breath. We need to form a structure that is the very essence of friendliness, and that structure will release its essence into the world. Falcior took a breath. We must fight for the principles of goodness no matter the cost. Would you not agree? I would, Grayle nodded. Ionatta is only a first step, you understand. It is my dream to end war, to give the world the pleasures of ionic resonance. But there's complications. Grayle nodded again. He knew about complications. Enough of my jabbering. It seems like you haven't had your breakfast. We'll feed you and then see where we can fit you in. Grayle was swept up in the words like he'd never been swept up in them before. He felt like his life had finally found the importance he'd always knew it had, deep down. Destiny had finally led him to here and now. Before breakfast, Grayle noticed the excitement had shaken up his bowels, and he had to humble himself and ask the other guards for the location of the outhouse. The seat was a finely polished stump, and he enjoyed his time sitting there. He thought more about his family. They never really seemed to have any principles, at least not compared to the principles laid out by Falcior. They told him to be virtuous and good, but it had never really mattered if he was those things. They were words. Just words. Not words in the way Falcior used words. Grayle returned to the group, and Falcior asked if he'd like to join him in his private dining room. "We'll have a little party, just the two of us. One needs to eat to fill in the cracks left by pitiful society. Each day is another chance to change the world." Grayle was looking forward to understanding what he meant. Chapter Miniwoona. Exiting the mountain into a dreary afternoon, Francis wasn't feeling much of anything. He was almost glad to feel stressed when Spliff told him to check his pockets in a communal moment of panic as they passed the guards, feeling their immigrant status, patting their pockets to check if they still had their pieces of paper stamped for entry. Luckily, in all the doings of yesterday, they'd both managed to forget the papers were on them. Perhaps his senses were shutting down in response to overstimulation, Francis thought, as he followed Spliff, not even pretending to know where he was going or how he was going to be capable of helping. Oddly, this feeling of nothing felt like happiness. Or maybe he was conflating the sensation of not feeling to happiness. He thought, happiness is living in full awareness of the transience of self. This reminded him of mantras in general, and his mantra through so many years of wandering. The nice part of having nothing is you can leave it anywhere. Though he would miss his ironwood kettle if he had to leave without it. It was his all-time lover. No other had warmed him on as many cold nights. And then they were at a door of a shack, and Spliff was double-checking the hand-drawn map given to them by Tycho. The shack looked like 3 chicken coops smashed together in a tornado. They were on the outskirts of Little Iona, next to a rough-sown field of commingled hemp and soybeans. There was a distinct smell on the air. Many Druids thought of hemp as the defining plant of Druidism. Creatures who made it part of their habitat were spiritually aligned with Druidic forces. Francis made eye contact with a large blackbird which had stopped digging in the field with its beak to watch them. Francis nodded at the bird, and he might have sworn it nodded back before it returned to its hunt for seed and grubs. "This has to be it," Spliff said, trying to convince himself. He knocked the coded knock on the doorframe. 3 knocks, 1 slow knock, then finally 2 quick raps. They heard shuffling, then the door half opened. The smell of hemp rolled out of the cottage. Miniwoona was surprised to see a gnome she had never met who knew the knock. She kept one hand firmly on the door. She asked them their purpose. Spliff was only now realizing he didn't have a coherent answer to that question, at least not one which could be summed up in a sentence. "We are friends of Tycho's. We read your pamphlet and want to know more," he finally splurted. Again his anxiety seemed to be getting the better of him. Min didn't want any attention on her house, so she hurried them inside. It was not a space designed for receiving guests. Out of the corner she brought a couple crates. She emptied the dry goods hastily onto a table already cluttered. She set down the crates and Spliff sat easily, but Francis felt like he couldn't handle another awkward sitting position today. His knees ached. He declined and stayed standing, which Min found suspicious, but not enough so that she didn't return to her rough wood chair with faded cushion. "What do you want to know?" She started with a frankness which suggested she had more information than they were capable of understanding, and who actually wanted understanding anyway. Francis raised his eyebrows in agreement. She was right to be skeptical. Spliff began slowly, though grateful, to get right to the point. "In your pamphlet, you suggested the humans were stockpiling arms. Do you think that's in any way connected to Falcior and the box, the free light?" Francis noted that the question piqued her curiosity. "We haven't been able to convince many, but absolutely they're connected," Min said. "Are they allied?" Spliff asked. "Yes, of course." Now Min was confused. Why was this gnome pointing out the obvious? Finally, Spliff blundered into the question he'd wanted to know from the very moment he'd arrived home. But what is he getting out of it, this Falcior? Miniwoona reached down by her chair and picked up her fiddle. She held it in her arms like a child and plucked a series of coherent notes, the start of some famous song Francis was sure he'd heard on the road somewhere. She continued, "There's this idea. Think of a spider. Is the spider just a spider? No, it's also its web. It needs the web to eat. One could even argue that the spider's web is more of what the spider is than the spider itself." This thought touched Spliff. He immediately understood the implication, even if it didn't really help him at all. Francis also enjoyed the thought, recognized it from the smell in the shack and the dirty pipe and used matches on the table. He couldn't help pushing back. He jumped deeper into the implication. This suggests that individual consciousness is unimportant. But imagine if the spider had no impediments, kept weaving webs between every branch, between every alley. It would make the whole world its web, in which case everything would be its consciousness, which, if one were to abuse the metaphor and take it literally, there's only one true consciousness which runs all things. But there's too much misunderstanding for such a thing. "I think you're missing the point," Spliff said, irritated, looking up at the Druid from his crate. Min plucked at her fiddle and let out a small smile. It was always such a hassle to get into the mountain for a bit of company and conversation. It was nice to have it come to her for a change. "I won't deny that," Francis joked, looking at Spliff, "though one must also acknowledge that there are spiders which don't weave webs at all." "You of all people," Spliff seemed genuinely disgusted, "always talking about the connectedness of everything, and this you have a problem with?" Francis held up his hands with a smile. Min said it was okay. "He's refusing to understand the changes coming for this world. They all do." Spliff returned his attention to Min. "So, what do you think he's trying to catch in his web?" "Men are more grandiose than spiders," Min continued, plucking on the fiddle. "My guess, he wants the whole mountain. He's told the men they just need to wait, but they get more agitated and restless by the week. The crime here is getting really bad. Women don't leave their homes at night. That's the only time I do leave." "What makes you believe they are allied?" Francis asked, not really questioning, just needing to fill out the picture in his mind. Miniwoona didn't tell them all of the details from her fateful evening, but made a suggestion about having an encounter with the boss of the human miners, whom they called Calumny. How he kept Iona under strict control, as if the main goal was for gnomes in the mountain to forget the humans were even here. "I can't believe the gnomes won't hear this," Spliff said, genuinely perplexed after a day of many perplexities. "Why haven't you left?" Francis asked Min. "Perhaps, unlike you, I am afraid of the entire world becoming a web from which we cannot untangle ourselves," Min said. Her comment was not aimed to wound, but it was also not benign playfulness. As a means of understanding what had happened to her, she had started down a dark and untraveled path. She didn't want to believe that there was no place for her in this world, couldn't believe that. She'd had many nights where she considered taking her life. Then, one night, sitting alone, hidden in the hemp fields, she realized she had never really been anything. Miniwoona had the sense an individual could be many things erratically, and she had been many different people. It was common for an elf to feel this way. It was built into the culture. But she lacked true courage, to stand up for herself. The courage to be one thing, one being who wouldn't be turned over like fresh dirt. To have deep roots inside herself. Still, upon hearing the comment aimed at him, Francis couldn't help himself, wouldn't have understood why he should hold back. "Well, what I was saying is either the word world is already a web, or it already isn't. If it's capable of being a web, I mean, there's the wind, rain, weather, the random..." And he was cut off by Spliff, who stood quickly from the crate he was sitting on in anger. "Francis," Spliff hissed, "do you think this doesn't concern you? Because it does." Spliff tried to relax and choose his words carefully. "Why do you think we are here?" Francis wasn't used to being chastised, had to run away from his old life for exactly such reasons, and wasn't going to adjust his attitude because someone else didn't like it. However, he had enough sense to acknowledge the pedantry. But pedantry was important sometimes, Or maybe that was a defense mechanism. Francis drifted away from the conversation and its possible confrontations. Only after a moment did his indignation return at the thought of being criticized for speaking. If there's nothing to be done, I don't understand what I could possibly do about any of it. Spliff appreciated this honesty, sat back down on the crate with a definitive crunch. A larger backside would have turned the crate to splinters. On that point I have had some thoughts. Min put down her fiddle and paused for effect. How would you get the Council of Gnomes to understand the danger they are in? It must be subtle. Better yet, they don't even know from who or why they are being told. Spliff was curious. That sounded good. If not impossible, but better to work backwards from the impossible than have no ideas at all. He urged Min to continue. It's common in the oral tradition that there will be a play inside a play. If you want everyone to understand something, do it covertly. Do it through song, theater. I think we should put on a play. I've been writing one. Miniwoona stood from her chair and shuffled some sheets loosely sprawled on the table. Out of another small stand drawer, she drew out a larger stack of papers and combined them, showing both of the visitors a fistful of text. Francis smiled. Spliff, having risen from his crate, was approaching the work instinctively, as if it was a blueprint for his absolution. Francis leaned into the role which had thrust upon him in the conversation, the skeptic. Who will be your actors? Min admitted on this point she was having some trouble. She handed the script over to Spliff, apologizing for her handwriting. Gnomes were not a theatrical people. None of her pamphleteer acquaintances had any interest or panache. Then the question becomes, does it need to be a good play? Francis joked. Miniwoona suggested that if they got her papers, she could find more human actors in the dome. Spliff was struggling to hold conversation and read the play, so he only scanned the words while asking out loud why her other gnome pamphleteers didn't get her the paperwork. They get me a day pass, but I have to put on this disguise. She gestured at a coat rack with various garb, a large hat for ostentatious merchants, which she could stuff up her messy dreads. If what you want is for gnomes inside the dome to realize the suffering happening at the hands of humans outside, wouldn't actors from outside be the most effective? Francis asked, trying to be helpful. Maybe, Min agreed, but it's too dangerous out here. I wouldn't know where to begin looking. Another set of complications for a day without real answers. Spliff was starting to second-guess this whole play idea. It would take too much time to help him. And this shack was nowhere he could comfortably hide. What the interaction seemed to be confirming was he could only judge the danger for him at the source, back with his family. Spliff's mood changed quickly as this realization zipped through the front of his mind. Min wanted to keep talking about the play as Spliff pretended to read as a courtesy until he said they should be going. Francis was surprised at this pivot, but never having known what he had to offer in the first place, was more than happy to leave. This Miniwoona person was eccentric and interesting, but he never felt like he'd gotten a handle on himself this day and was craving a bit of solitude. Can you help me? Min asked in a voice so close to desperation the companions felt genuinely bad. Spliff realized what a strange idea it had been to try and come to her for help. His access to resources outstripped hers tenfold. Spliff reached into his pocket and gave her his own mountain entrance papers. Then, realizing he'd need them to get back to the mountain, he asked for them back. I'll drop them at Tycho's, and he'll bring them to you. If I ever leave again, I'm leaving for good. Francis agreed, said he'd do the same. It felt good to be on the same page, even nonsensically, like what he assumed this elf's play would read like.